General Charles George Gordon arrived in China in 1860 as part of an invading British army that sought to exploit the country. But after travelling the land and immersing himself in the culture, he transformed into a loyal servant of the emperor, who commanded an army that helped defeat the Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s and played a pivotal role in preventing a war between China and Russia in the 1880s. During his lifetime, he was revered by both the British public and the rulers of the Qing dynasty, for which he earned the nickname Chinese Gordon. Yet today, despite his immense impact on both British and Chinese history, Chinese Gordon has largely been forgotten. In this documentary, we are going to explore the life of Chinese Gordon, in the process examining over 800 old historical documents, photographs, maps, and artifacts from the period, and we will also visit historical locations associated with Gordon himself. This is the story of Chinese Gordon. Charles George Gordon was born in the year 1833 in a town to the southeast of London called Woolwich. This town, situated on the south bank of the River Thames, was also home to Woolwich Barracks, which was at the time one of the foremost military and naval bases in Britain. It was also the barracks where Charles Gordon's father, Major General Henry William Gordon, was based. In the 19th century, men born into military families were expected to follow in their father's footsteps, and the Gordons' family connections to the British military stretched back generations. His great-grandfather, David Gordon, had fought for the British during the Jacobite Rising in 1745, although he was quickly captured by Scottish forces and only later released because of his Scottish ancestry. Following this incident, his great-grandfather then emigrated to Canada and gave birth to Charles's grandfather, William Augustus Gordon, who had a more illustrious military career. He fought alongside the famous British general James Wolfe at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. The British victory at this battle resulted in parts of the French territories in North America being transferred over to British control, which ultimately led to the creation of Canada within the British Empire. Charles's father, Henry William Gordon, too found fame fighting in the Napoleonic Wars against the expansionist French Empire in the early 19th century. His father saw combat on both the Spanish Peninsula and in Italy. Given Charles Gordon's ancestry, it is not surprising that Gordon would follow a career in the military. But Gordon's family were also devout Anglican Christians, and his religious upbringing formed another facet of his character that would also have a strong influence on his life to come. In the year 1855, Gordon completed his military training at the Royal School of Military Engineering in Chatham, Kent, and was sent on his first military assignment abroad to the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean War, which had begun 2 years prior to Gordon's arrival in 1853, was triggered primarily because of the Russian Empire's desire to annex some of the land from the waning Ottoman Empire, which would greatly increase the empire's size, power, and reach. To prevent the expansion of the Russian Empire, an alliance was formed consisting of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Old Kingdom of Sardinia. As part of the anti-Russian alliance, Charles Gordon took part in many battles, including one of the most pivotal of the war, the Siege of Sevastopol. Gordon's role during the siege was to map the Russian fortifications of the city fortress of Sevastopol so that the Allies could plan their artillery bombardment and assault. The brutality of this siege must have been a character-building moment for Gordon, and no doubt would have conditioned him not to fear future conflicts, but would also help him understand firsthand the loss and sacrifices that war demands. Although he did suffer a minor injury from a Russian sniper bullet during his survey, Gordon was able to successfully complete his task and facilitated the Allied victory in the siege in September 1855. Through his achievements, Gordon had proved himself as a capable and brave young officer, and also for having the ability to always understand and predict the enemy's plans. It was said at the British headquarters that if you want to know what the Russians are up to, send for Charlie Gordon. Photography was relatively new at the time, having only been invented a little over a decade earlier in 1839, and the images from the Crimean War are some of the first war photographs ever taken, although, due to the cumbersome nature of early photographic equipment, images could not be taken in the heat of battle, but could only be taken of the devastated battlefield after the cessation of hostilities. After Sevastopol, the Allies continued to inflict several more defeats upon the Russians until they ultimately secured victory in the conflict in March 1856. As part of the peace agreement, Russia had agreed to back down from its expansionist territorial ambitions, and therefore it was necessary to clarify in the peace treaty exactly where the new legal boundaries of the Russian Empire were. Gordon again played a role here, serving on the commission that set about demarcating the new border between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. In recognition of his contributions towards the war effort, Gordon was one of the 275,000 British soldiers who were awarded the Crimea Medal after the conflict, and he was promoted to the rank of captain in April 1859. This is the first photograph that we have of Gordon himself, which was likely taken just after he was made a captain of the Royal Engineers in 1859. At the time, he was aged only 26. For an idea of what his complete Royal Engineers captain's uniform would have looked like, we can look at this full body image of William John Engledew, who was promoted to the rank of captain soon after Gordon in 1871. Unfortunately, all of the photos from the period are black and white, but if it were colour, we would see that the jacket would have been bright scarlet red and the trousers navy blue. After having proved himself in the Crimean War, in July 1860, the British military sent Gordon on his next overseas military posting, this time to a country that would later become inseparable from him: China. The China that Gordon was sent to was in a turbulent state. The ruling Qing dynasty was simultaneously under attack on two fronts, battling both an internal insurrection of dissatisfied Chinese and an external invasion from a combination of British and French forces. The war between the allied British and French against the Qing, commonly known as the Second Opium War, had its origins in a trade disagreement between the two sides. The British believed that the Qing were not fully abiding by the terms of the treaty signed at the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing, which had legalized foreign trade conducted through 5 specific treaty ports and forced China to engage in foreign diplomatic relations. Numerous trade disputes throughout the 1840s and 1850s resulted in repeated acts of aggression, and after Chinese authorities compounded a British cargo ship they believed had been involved in piracy in 1856, the British, in an alliance with the French, declared war on the Qing in order to force them to permit foreign trade and diplomatic relations. Many of the individuals who had been involved in the First Opium War were conspicuously also involved in the Second. The British Prime Minister during the outbreak of the Second Opium War, Lord Palmerston, was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs at the outbreak of the First Opium War, and the commander of the British troops in China and Hong Kong when Gordon arrived, General Sir James Hope Grant, was a British military veteran who had originally distinguished himself in the Battle of Zhenjiang in 1842 during the climax of the First Opium War. Gordon arrived in China near the end of the conflict in September 1860 as the British and French were making their final assault on the capital, Beijing. A month prior, in August, the foreign troops had set out from their camp on the coastal city of Tianjin and travelled up the Haihe River that led straight towards the capital of the Qing Empire, Beijing. The river had originally been fortified by a series of defensive forts back in the 16th century during the Ming Dynasty to defend against pirate attacks. These forts, named the Taku Forts, were later rebuilt and expanded in the 19th century by the Qing, and they now posed a strong defense against attackers attempting to use the river to attack the capital. In the summer of 1859, the British forces had been defeated by the Chinese defenders at the forts when they had tried to assault the capital the first time. They had been pushed back to the coast at Tianjin, where they were forced to wait for the winter to pass before they could launch an assault on the capital a second time. For their second assault in August 1860, the British forces changed their tactics. Instead of assaulting the forts from the front of the river, they would first disembark upstream and then attack the forts from behind, where the Chinese forces were exposed. This time the British were victorious, and these photos were taken immediately after the British had defeated the Chinese and captured the forts on August the 21st, 1860. Gordon caught up with the Anglo-French forces just after they had successfully captured the Taku forts, and interestingly, in Gordon's personal notes, he compares the landscape of the banks of the river Haihe to that of Barking on the River Thames, which was incidentally near his birthplace of Woolwich. Gordon continued with the British forces to capture the capital on the 6th of October 1860. Upon arrival, they were surprised to find that the Emperor had fled, and that many of the British negotiators who had been sent in advance of the army to resolve the conflict through dialogue had been murdered. The British officers were infuriated by the murder of their men and sought for a way to avenge their deaths. They headed to the Yihe Yuan, an imperial garden to the northwest of Beijing. The expansive garden complex was meticulously designed to provide the most stunning views for the Qing royal family, and was complete with man-made lakes, hills, and rock formations. The garden was also home to numerous pavilions and palaces that were full of priceless works of art, and between the 7th and 9th of October, these treasures fell prey to the looting from the wary British and French soldiers. After the most valuable objects had been successfully looted, the British High Commissioner to China, James Bruce, the 8th Earl of Elgin, ordered the burning of the Summer Palace, starting on the 18th of October. His justification was that it was an act of revenge for the murder by the Qing of the British captives. Yet the British public were shocked by the vandalism, and when news of the burning of the imperial gardens was reported in the British press, it was heavily criticised. Yet the damage had already been done, and the treasures had already been looted. Gordon had joined in the looting, personally stealing a cushion cover embroidered with the imperial 5-clawed dragon, a lotus-shaped bowl, and most notably the imperial throne of Emperor Shunzhi, the first Qing emperor to rule over the whole of China proper. In his personal letters, Gordon reports with great satisfaction that he was able to get such beautiful loot, but also expresses irritation that he was pressured by his fellow Royal Engineers to present some of the loot as a joint gift to the Royal Engineers to be used in the mess, which is the location where the troops eat and rest. This brass plaque from the back of the throne chair was retained by Gordon, and he kept it throughout his lifetime. The war with China was soon concluded with the Treaty of Beijing on the 24th of October 1860, in which China agreed to pay a large indemnity to Britain and France, allowed foreign ambassadors to reside in the capital, and also gave up Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, as well as parts of Outer Manchuria to the Russian Empire. As part of the treaty, Britain was to be allocated a territorial concession in Tianjin, the city on the mouth of the Haihe River, from which the British had launched their attack on Beijing the previous August. From a commercial point of view, Tianjin had been important for centuries because it lay at the northern terminus of the Grand Canal, which had been used for centuries to transport resources from the productive regions in the south to the capital in the north. The British also understood that opening this port would give them a base from which they could sell British produce, such as Yorkshire textiles, into the capital. It also offered a base from which they could launch an attack on the capital again if necessary. This is a sketch of what Tianjin would have looked like in 1861, drawn by a young British officer named Frank Sadlier Breton, who himself would later grow up to be an architect. The city lacked the infrastructure for the large volumes of trade that the British had envisaged, and as this map from 1862 shows, it was a relatively small city, enclosed by a large city wall, as was common in Chinese cities at the time. Yet, the British were not given the city itself as a concession, but were allocated an area of what was then a village known as the Purple Bamboo Forest, Zizhu Lincun, which covered an area of just over 282,000 square kilometers. After the conclusion of the Second Opium War, Gordon spent the next 18 months residing in the city of Tianjin, during which time he took part in the planning of the new British concession to the south. Over the following half a century, the blueprints that Gordon had devised were used as the foundations for the British concession in Tianjin, and by the turn of the 20th century, his designs had been realised. The layout of Tianjin today is still based off of the plans Gordon devised in the 19th century. Gordon also made the most of his free time to travel extensively in northern China. He is reported to have rode at least 20 times from Tianjin to the Taku forts, a round trip of a distance of over 80 miles. It can be assumed that he was studying the forts during these trips, as the knowledge of the defences and what their weaknesses were would be of great use to him in the future. In August 1861, he returned to Beijing this time to visit the newly established British legation, whose opening was authorised in the Convention of Beijing the previous year. Inside, he met with Frederick Bruce, the new British envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to the Xianfeng Emperor. In the winter of 1861, Gordon embarked on an extended trip along the Great Wall of China, visiting remote and isolated villages that had never before been seen by European eyes. He followed the Great Wall along its route to the north into Inner Mongolia. This excursion into northern China offered him his first chance to see up close the real China, and enabled him to get a better grasp of its people and culture. We can assume that this journey had a large impact on Gordon and on his views towards the Chinese people. Gordon's personal journey inside China, which he undertook at the age of just 28, marked a turning point in his life. After his return, Gordon's status in China shifted from that of a member of an aggressive foreign power seeking to exploit China to that of a friend who was offering his support to the struggling Qing dynasty.